Welcome back to Medieval Art. I'm Dr. Brian Keane, and again, I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Larissa Grolleman. I wanted to begin with an important phrase that we heard over and over again in Game of Thrones, which is Valar Morghulis, all men must die. And that was my thought leaving this episode this week, that all men must die. And the second part about all men must serve, I'm over it. Larissa, we dealt primarily in this episode with relationships, and more specifically, the power roles in sexual relationships and the effect of those types of interactions at court. So what stood out to you as we specifically heard from the showrunners about the role of women again in this imaginary fantasy world?
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of troubled by this episode and the way that things played out, especially because the shadow of the Middle Ages and of medievalizing fantasy especially seems to loom so large and sort of cast such a long pall over these relationships. I was interested to see that it feels like the showrunners have taken the criticisms of previous seasons of Game of Thrones, and instead of providing us with a view into sexual violence, into the politics of rape, they've given us a vision of female agency with sexual relationships, and it feels sort of equally as uncomfortable. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but it just didn't sit right with me kind of watching it play out. It felt very forced. It felt very sort of artificial in a way. And it made me think of the ways in which the showrunners believe themselves to be in dialogue with the past and the kind of politics of medieval relationships as they're shown to us in modern fantasy. I think we have this idea of medieval relationships as being inherently patriarchal, inherently political, and we certainly got a glimpse of that with Rhaenyra kind of going through her list of suitors, but then ultimately being betrothed to the guy that her dad was probably going to betroth her to anyway. So she really didn't have any agency in that. And the whole thing feels a little farcical almost. It feels like a real kind of simplification of what we believe about medieval relationships and what we believe about medieval marriage.
I agree with you. I think you're right that we opened the episode with this long line of suitors, and we're introduced to some of the humor of those rituals, of the age disparities, both older and much younger for the person betrothed, in this case, Rhaenyra. And even then, she didn't seem to have so much agency because she was being advised that was unwise thing to say. This is a prudent match. And then moving forward, you're right, there was something uncomfortable, something icky. And I liked the comments that she made to Viserys that if a prince of the realm had bedded whomever he chose, no one at court would bat an eye. But her actions are so heavily guarded and looked after that she can't actually act on her own. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about the dialogue and the developing relationship between Rhaenyra and Alicent. They were sort of pouting and distant in the previous episode, but they shared some important moments, both of trust building or breaking, as it were. How did that sit with you?
I think the friendship between Alicent and Rhaenyra and the kind of rekindled friendship that they're having in these later episodes is the bright spot in the show, actually, because I do feel like it provides a moment of honesty and a sort of moment of modern reflection. Alicent in particular says that it doesn't matter what you did, like what the truth of the matter is. The real thing is the perception. And I think that gets back to the theme of rumors and hearsay and things that we've been sort of exploring throughout the season. But here, kind of brought home in a much more personal way, it feels like. But that friendship and the kind of, I think the dialogue between their different situations and relationships, that Alicent is in this marriage, which is politically advantageous and seems sort of personally rewarding, but there are aspects of it that she remains uncomfortable with, versus the more kind of consensual relationship that Rhaenyra has with Sir Criston, and maybe he is reluctant to even engage in that. So I think there is some the beginning of some interesting gender explorations there, but it's not sort of coming out in its full force yet, and it felt a little clumsily handled, I thought, in this episode.
I agree. When we think back to all of the seasons of Game of Thrones, even that after 8 seasons, there were so few women writers and directors. And of course, it's really important that there was a woman at the helm of this episode, but that also felt somewhat clumsy, not on her part, of course, but on the part of the show in general. So being conscious of the criticism, but why only relegate sort of a woman to direct a scene that is so intentionally based on a fantasy? I mean, what I expressed in our chat earlier as well together is that there are a lot of queer relationships in the matters that relate to this series. And I'm really interested to see how those subjects are dealt with, how they play out on screen. And if there is that kind of nod to any kind of history that acknowledges that there was, of course, queer presence in the past. I think another element that has come out in terms of the set design is the entire King's Landing, the palace itself. There are lots of sexualized imagery. Eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed the paintings or tapestries or other room decoration that seem both orgiastic or filled with scenes of sexual lust and temptation. They've reminded me of Greek vase painting with satyrs and humans. But the showrunners are reminding us that in the imagined worlds of Westeros and Essos, in George R.R. Martin's world, incest is part of court relationships. Incest is part of dynastic succession. And I know I'm remembering fondly one of your exhibitions about court life, that there are, of course, those details about how bloodlines were maintained and thought through. Was there anything else about just the way relationships are put on screen that stood out between husband and wife relationships, family relationships, individuals with their concubines or their sexual relations, and then just the desires of a young princess? Anything that leapt out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the gender politics, to your point, of the show, kind of more broadly, is actually coming to bear on the relationships on screen in these really interesting ways. And the characters that are written by certain genders of writers and the politics of writers' rooms, I think that's a really interesting kind of area of inquiry. I think for this show in particular, which has dealt with so much criticism in terms of the way that relationships are portrayed. And I think it's really fascinating that we have this very simplified view, I think, of medieval relationships and the way that medieval marriages happen, the kind of circumstances of incest and that kind of relationship, which are kind of spectacle in this show, that are meant to make you feel uncomfortable, but we're constantly reminded that Targaryens have this, weird proclivity to incestual relationships. And it's like, do we need to be reminded of that all the time? And I feel like the vision of the Middle Ages that this show is starting to present it's like becoming more and more narrow and sort of becoming more and more self-reflective or sort of recursive in terms of medieval fantasy, instead of actually going back to medieval history, which is at times far more interesting than the show seems to give it credit for.
I think you're right. And something to contend with is the unrecognized trauma that even the narratives themselves sort of recreate on screen for viewers who may have experienced or gone through similar circumstances. That's why I felt this episode was doing so many things clunkily and clumsily, as you say, because we're seeing the unrequited desire of seemingly forced sexual relationships, even in marriage, and in this sort of incestual relationship, but then also the lovemaking on one's own. I think that there is a way to acknowledge that we're in a fantasy world where dragons are flying freely. Why are we not seeing a world beyond this sort of imagined Middle Ages that has become so ingrained in a popular consciousness, and even from the writer's room of George R.R. Martin? So it's uncomfortable, I think, as we said, and there's still a lot to look forward to. Not least, there's still this prophecy on a dagger about the Song of Ice and Fire that's being teased out for those that know the future events. And then hopefully at some point we see a lot more dragons. So I'm sitting a little more world weary after this episode, but willing to watch it out.
I keep hoping for more sets, more interesting places, and I feel like we keep kind of rehashing the same places and people and even situations. And so I'm looking forward to more drama, I guess, and the introduction of Laenor, Lord Corlys's son, who will be Rhaenyra's new husband, and the kind of new political opportunities that opens up for the both of them, and hopefully some new characters that we can get to know a little bit better. And of course, we always hope for more dragons.
And on that note, I agree. And again, Valar Morghulis, because I am here for Rhaenyra's ascent and for Alicent's ascent to the throne. So we'll continue to watch as these relationships develop. Larissa, thank you again for joining, and we look forward to future conversations.